Welcome back to Green Dolphin Science, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into something pretty interesting, maybe even surprising, happening right in, well, many of our kitchens. We got hold of this research paper. It's titled Release of Micro and Nano-Sized Particles from Plastic Articles During Mechanical Dishwashing.
Yeah, and this study is quite significant because it's really the first one to try and, properly quantify the mass of plastics that come off common things like your Tupperware, your plastic spoons when you run them through the dishwasher.
Okay, so let's break this down. Our mission, you could say, for this deep dive is to figure out what this research is telling us. Are our dishwashers like a hidden source of plastic pollution?
How much plastic are we actually talking about?
Exactly, and what kinds? And maybe most importantly, why should you even care about this sort of relatively unexplored area?
Right. It's really about sorting through it all. Using the data from this specific study to see what's a genuine finding versus, maybe getting overly alarmed. We already know that plastic and wastewater is a massive problem globally. Studies have pointed fingers at things like synthetic clothes shedding fibers in the washing machine, or those microbeads from cosmetics.
Yeah, but this paper makes a good point. Finding all the big sources is really key, because the best way to tackle environmental plastic is stopping it at the source.
That's the ideal, yeah. And dishwashers, they're everywhere. About 73% of U.S. homes have one, 58% in Australia, maybe 20% worldwide on average. And think about what they do to plastics.
High heat.
Yeah, up to 70 degrees C sometimes, plus strong detergents, and just the, physical blasting from the water jets. It kind of makes sense they might be wearing plastics down.
And people have looked at this before, right? Found some particles.
They have, yeah. Previous studies found some microplastic release. I think one reported up to 166 particles per cycle, give or take. But the methods back then, they were mostly limited. They couldn't really detect particles smaller than about 20 micrometers.
Ah, okay. So the really tiny stuff was missed.
Pretty much. That left a big question mark about the smaller microplastics, and especially the nanoplastics, which are even tinier. So this new study, it specifically set out to fill that gap. They use more advanced techniques like GCMS.
Right, that sounds technical.
It is, a bit. Pyrolysis gas chromatography mass spectrometry. It basically lets them identify what kind of plastic it is and measure the mass, even for those really small particles, way below 20 micrometers, down into the nano range.
So how did they actually do it? What was the experiment like?
Well, they took 21 brand new plastic things, containers, utensils, made of the common stuff. Polypropylene, that's PP, polyethylene, PE, polystyrene, PS.
The usual suspects in the kitchen.
Exactly. PT, like drink bottles, and nylon 6-2. All stuff labeled dishwasher safe. And they were careful to measure the surface area. They washed them first, like multiple times, just to clean off any manufacturing dust. Then they put them in a regular home dishwasher, used a standard cycle pre-rinse, hot wash at 70 degrees C, couple of rinses with a normal detergent tablet, and they collected the wastewater from that cycle.
And used those fancy techniques to see what was in the water?
Yep, precisely.
Yeah.
That GCMS to identify the plastics and measure the mass. They also use something called FlowSync, which counts the particles and tells you their size range, how many small ones, how many slightly bigger ones.
Okay.
And scanning electron microscopy, SEM, to actually look at the shape of the particles and confirm they were, bits of plastic.
And you mentioned something really crucial earlier. They didn't just wash the plastic items, they ran blanks.
Yes, this is super important for this kind of research. They ran the dishwasher with just tap water.
Yep.
Then they ran it with tap water and the detergent tablet.
Yeah.
But crucially, no plastic items inside.
Why is that so important?
Because it helps you figure out if any plastic particles are coming from somewhere else. Like, is there already plastic in the tap water? Is the dishwasher machine itself shedding bits, maybe the racks or the spray arms? Or is the detergent contributing particles? It lets you subtract that background noise.
Got it. So you can be more confident the particles you measure after washing the items actually came from those items.
Exactly. So the big headline finding, yes, definitely. Microplastics and nanoplastics are released from these everyday plastic items during a dishwasher cycle.
Okay, hit us with the big number then. How many particles are we talking per wash cycle?
Well, after they did that background subtraction, their estimate is pretty striking. Around 916,800 micro and nanoparticles released per cycle. That was in their setup with a 15-liter water volume.
Wow, nearly 1 million particles per wash. That just sounds huge. What does that translate to, annually for a household?
Okay, so they did a rough calculation, kind of a worst case maybe, assuming a full load each time, using global dishwasher ownership numbers. Their estimate comes out to potentially around 33 million particles released per household per year globally.
33 million. Okay. Lots of particles. But was it the same for all the plastics? Did everything shed equally?
No, and that's another really interesting finding. It varied quite a bit depending on the type of plastic. For instance, things made of PE, PP, and polyethylene, polypropylene, polystyrene, they tended to release more particles in the larger size range they measured, so bigger than 2.7 micrometers.
Okay, so still tiny, but the chunkier end of microplastics.
Right, but PE, that's like your water bottles and nylon 6 behave differently. They release particles more evenly across all the size ranges they tested, from the really tiny 0.01 micrometer ones up to the bigger ones.
Huh. So maybe they break down differently.
It suggests that, yeah, maybe a different kind of fragmentation. And the differences were even clearer when they looked at the release per square centimeter of plastic washed.
Ah, like a shedding rate.
Exactly. Polystyrene, PS, had the highest rate by far, about 340 nanograms per square centimeter. Then PP was next at around 120, PE around 85, nylon 6 about 22, and PD was the lowest, only about 11 nanograms per square centimeter.
Wait, so PS is shedding what, like 30 times more mass per area than PET?
Roughly, yeah. A 30-fold difference between the highest and lowest they tested. It really shows that the type of plastic matters a lot. Maybe PS is just more brittle or reacts differently to the heat and stress.
That is a huge difference. Okay, back to those blank washes. You said they found plastic even when there were no plastic items in there. Where was that coming from?
Yes, they did. They found PP, PS, PE, and nylon 6 in the tap water blank and also in the dishwasher blank that had the detergent. So it confirms that particles can come from the water supply itself, or maybe bits shedding off the dishwasher's internal parts, racks, coatings, pipes, or potentially from the detergent.
Did they test the detergent itself?
They did, yeah. Using the PyRG CMS directly on the detergent tablet, they found PE and PP in there, mostly in the smaller size ranges, 0.3 to 2.7 micrometers.
So the soap itself can contain plastic particles.
It seems so, which, just highlights how tricky it is to study these things. Getting a truly clean baseline is a real challenge in environmental microplastic research.
Yeah.
So we have this huge particle number, nearly 1 million per cycle. But the study also looked at the mass. And that gives a pretty different angle on it.
Right. Let's switch gears from particle count to actual weight. How much plastic mass are we talking about being released?
Okay, so based on their scenarios, like estimating an average wash might have one big container, say 1,000 square centimeters, of each of the 5 plastics they tested, they calculated a potential global annual release from all dishwashers. And the number is around 48,000 kilograms per year.
48,000 kilos globally.
Yeah.
Okay, still sounds like a lot, but how does that break down per person for you listening at home?
Well, when you crunch those numbers down to a per-person average based on global dishwasher use, it becomes surprisingly small. We're talking less than 6 milligrams per person per year.
Less than 6 milligrams a year. That sounds tiny. Can you compare that to something real?
Yeah, the authors did a great job here. They pointed out that 6 milligrams is way less than the weight of a single grain of rice. A typical grain of rice is about 25 milligrams.
Wow. Okay, that really puts it in perspective. So, huge number of particles, but the actual amount of plastic material shed per person annually is less than a grain of rice worth. That's quite a contrast.
It really is. And it shows why you need both numbers, right? The particle count tells you about fragmentation, the sheer quantity of tiny bits. The mass tells you the total material lost. And the potential impact environmentally or health-wise might depend on which of those is more important, or maybe both. And to give even more context, they compared their dishwasher estimates to what's actually measured arriving at wastewater treatment plants.
Okay, so connecting the dishwasher output to the bigger wastewater picture. What slice of the pie are we talking about? How much of the total plastic going into a treatment plant might come just from dishwashers based on this?
Well, their analysis suggests it's a very, very small slice overall. For the total plastic load measured at the treatment plants they looked at, the dishwasher contribution was estimated at only about 0.02 to 0.07%.
So almost negligible in terms of total mass.
In terms of total mass, yes. However, remember how much more polystyrene shed compared to the others.
Right, the 30-fold difference.
Exactly. So when they look specifically at the polystyrene load in the wastewater, the dishwasher contribution relative to just PS was potentially higher. Maybe around 1 to 4% of all the PS entering the plant could be coming from dishwashers.
Ah, okay. So maybe not a huge driver of the total plastic problem via wastewater, but dishwashers are a source, and for specific plastics like PS, maybe a more noteworthy source than we thought.
That seems to be the takeaway. It's nuanced. And of course, we need to remember the limitations. The authors are very clear about this being a first look.
Right. What are the big ones? What should we keep in mind about this study?
Well, first off, it was just one dishwasher model, one detergent type, one wash cycle, one temperature. Real life is way more varied, right? Different machines, eco settings, different soaps. That could all change things.
Makes sense.
And crucially, they used brand new, clean plastic items. Your stuff at home. It gets old, scratched, maybe stained with tomato sauce.
Yeah, mine definitely looks well loved.
Exactly. Food residues, grease, and just the wear and tear, the aging of the plastic that could easily affect how much it sheds. They even suggest older plastics might break down more.
That seems logical. An old brittle container might shed more than a new flexible one.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Also, they only looked at those 5 main plastics. They didn't investigate additives mixed into the plastics or other chemicals that might leach out. And there are always challenges with measuring such tiny things. Maybe SEM images aren't perfect. Maybe the particle counter picks up some non-plastic bits, although the mass measurement is pretty solid for identifying the plastic.
So lots more research needed then.
Absolutely. We need studies looking at multiple wash cycles over time, different temperatures, different detergents, definitely looking at aged materials, and better modeling to account for how people actually use their dishwashers.
Okay, so bringing it all together for you listening, what's the bottom line? The mass seems small per person, less than that grain of rice per year, maybe. Is this dishwasher shedding something to worry about?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Or maybe the 916,800 particle question. Look, even if the mass per cycle is small, it's happening constantly, day after day, week after week, in millions of homes.
Right. It adds up.
It potentially adds up globally. And remember, wastewater treatment plants aren't perfect. Some particles get through into rivers and oceans, and a lot gets trapped in the sludge, the biosolids.
Which often ends up on farmland.
Yeah, spread on agricultural land as fertilizer. So those plastics could end up in our soil.
The study mentions source control being key. Did they suggest any ways to maybe reduce the specific source?
They did. They pointed to washing machines, where people are already using filters or traps, like lint traps, but from microfibers, to catch shedding from clothes.
Okay.
So they suggest that even if the individual contribution from dishwashers seems low based on mass, maybe advocating for similar filters or traps in dishwashers could be a practical step. Just another way to capture those particles right at the source in your appliance, reducing what goes down the drain.
Interesting idea. So this deep dive, it really paints a complex picture. Dishwashers do release micro and nanoplastics, potentially hundreds of thousands per cycle, but the mass per person seems quite low.
Yeah, less than that grain of rice annually based on their assumptions. But the type of plastic makes a huge difference. Remember, polystyrene shedding way more. And there's this whole issue of background plastics, from water, the machine, the detergent. It's a newly quantified pathway, really.
What strikes me is just thinking about the scale of these invisible particles everywhere. Billions from a tea bag, apparently. Millions from a baby bottle. Now hundreds of thousands per dishwasher load.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How all these tiny, seemingly minor releases from just living our lives, how they might be adding up on a global scale, becoming this pervasive background presence in our environment.
Definitely food for thought. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.